Everyone assumed grief had already stolen everything from him. But what Prince William did on Diana's 65th birthday didn't merely reopen old wounds. It revealed a quiet shift inside the royal family nobody was ever meant to notice. July 1, 2026. A date that should have felt ordinary, almost forgettable across the royal calendar. But it didn't. Because this wasn't simply another birthday. It marked the 65th birthday of a woman who never had the chance to grow old, never had the chance to watch her grandchildren laugh, never had the chance to stand beside the very institution that once struggled desperately to contain her. And that's where everything starts feeling suspicious. Because instead of turning it into some grand royal spectacle, the kind packed with speeches, cameras, and perfectly rehearsed emotion, William chose something completely different. Something quieter, something almost invisible. And that silence somehow screamed louder than any palace announcement possibly could. No statement, no official portrait, no carefully staged tribute, only absence. And in royal circles, absence is almost never accidental, because here's the question nobody seems willing to ask aloud. Why step away on a day like this? Why embrace privacy when the entire world seemed ready for another carefully shared moment of collective mourning? Unless that decision was the real message. Unless this wasn't about honoring Diana the way the institution prefers, polished, distant, controlled, but instead in a way that quietly pulled her memory away from the palace and returned it to something deeply personal and undeniably powerful. 4 years, the monarchy has balanced carefully around Diana's legacy. Never too much, never too little, just enough to acknowledge her without allowing her to completely reshape the narrative. But this time something changed. And it didn't happen before cameras. It happened far away from them. Because behind closed doors, whispers slowly began surfacing. Never loudly, never officially, just scattered fragments, a private visit, a quiet journey, a decision that felt strikingly intentional. And once those pieces started fitting together, the picture became impossible to dismiss. Think about it. Eller, that secluded island surrounded by water, hidden beyond public reach, a place untouched by royal protocol, untouched by relentless press intrusion, untouched by everything Diana spent her life enduring. That island has always stood apart, untouchable, and suddenly that's exactly where attention shifted. No confirmation, of course not. There never is with moments like these, but sources close enough to know reportedly hinted at something impossible to ignore. William didn't want another performance. He wanted distance, not from Diana, but from everything surrounding her. And that changes absolutely everything. Because for nearly 3 decades, grief has been something he's been expected to perform. Every glance, every appearance, every anniversary, observed, analyzed, dissected. A boy walking behind a coffin, pushed into a moment the world has never allowed him to escape. And now that same boy, grown into a future king, quietly makes a decision that completely overturns the entire script. No audience, no expectations, just a son returning to the one place where the story has never truly been rewritten. But here's where everything becomes even more unsettling, because he wasn't alone. And that tiny, almost ignored detail is exactly where the emotional weight finally crashes down. Because suddenly, this isn't only about remembering Diana. It's about introducing her to an entirely new generation. To children who know her name but have never heard her voice, who recognize her face but never experienced her presence. And William, it appears, has decided that simply isn't enough anymore. He's been preparing for this moment far longer than anyone ever suspected. Quietly, carefully sharing stories never intended for headlines, revealing photographs that never appeared inside documentaries, rebuilding a real person from scattered fragments so his children don't inherit a legend, they inherit a memory. Then comes the moment that completely changes the atmosphere. Princess Charlotte, not merely a daughter, not simply a child standing at the edge of royal history, but the one who carries Diana's name. And recently, those close enough to witness have begun noticing something remarkable. A resemblance. Maybe not only through appearance, but through presence, warmth, and something far more difficult to explain, yet impossible to overlook. Now she's asking questions, simple ones, quiet ones, the kind that reach deeper than any public tribute ever possibly could. Who was she? What was she really like? Would she have loved me? Questions that don't belong inside history books, questions that belong within a family. And in that instant, something shifts once more. Because this isn't about loss anymore. It's about inheritance, not titles, not responsibilities, but something infinitely more delicate, memory. And William isn't simply protecting it anymore. He's passing it forward carefully, intentionally, almost as though he understands this is exactly how Diana survives. Not through monuments, not through carefully crafted statements, but through stories shared behind closed doors, through a father describing a grandmother his children will never meet yet somehow still come to know. And if you step back and truly examine it, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. A childhood where grief became public, almost expected, transformed into a fatherhood where memory is protected, controlled, deliberately chosen. No procession this time. No staring crowds, no impossible expectations, only a quiet moment that somehow carried greater weight than any royal ceremony ever possibly could. And maybe that's the real story after all. Because while the world waited for another tribute, William offered something completely different. He quietly reclaimed Diana, pulling her back from headlines, back from the institution, back from the narrative that tried to define her, and placed her exactly where she had always belonged, inside his family. Because the truth is, whatever happened during that private moment was never intended to be completely witnessed. Yet the fragments that eventually surfaced tell a story much bigger than anyone imagined. What truly unfolded wasn't dramatic in the way royal watchers have come to expect. There were no sweeping gestures, no carefully scheduled appearances. No speeches crafted to dominate headlines. Instead, it became something almost haunting in its simplicity. A father standing where absence lingered, trying to transform that emptiness into something his children could genuinely understand. And that's exactly where the emotional tension begins rising. Because how do you explain someone who changed the world yet is no longer here to stand within it? Still, according to what has quietly surfaced, William never tried explaining Diana the way the world remembered her. He stripped everything away. No titles, no legends, no perfectly polished legacy. Just moments, tiny ones, the kind that never fill history books but somehow define an entire person. The way she laughed, the way she ignored rules without asking permission, the way she made people feel noticed when everyone else looked away. And as those memories slowly passed from father to children, something almost unspoken quietly began taking shape, a version of Diana that belongs to them instead of the world. But then comes the detail that observers keep circling back to, the Charlotte moment, which never unfolded in front of cameras but still sent its emotional echo far beyond that private space it remained. Because when a child starts reaching toward someone they've never met, something in the entire narrative shifts, turning remembrance into something closer to living continuation itself it becomes. Sources suggest Charlotte didn't simply listen. She reacted, leaned closer, asked more questions, not surface curiosity but something that lingers deeply afterwards, still present. And that's where the emotional weight lands hardest. Because in that moment William wasn't just remembering his mother, he was watching her come alive again through another. And if that sounds dramatic, it should, because for a family always careful with emotion, this becomes something entirely different, raw, unfiltered inheritance that refuses to stay contained within boundaries at all times. Because consider what this quietly disrupts. 4 decades Diana's memory lived in controlled space, acknowledged, respected, but never fully handed over or fully released before now. There was always a sense her story belonged partly to institution, partly to history, and only partly to her family itself as well. But now that balance is shifting without announcement, without permission, without ceremony, because William didn't speak loudly, but his decision was unmistakably decisive and final in tone at this moment now. And that decision doesn't only affect the present, it reshapes the future entirely. Because George, Charlotte, and Louis are not growing up with a distant historical figure anymore, they're growing up with a grandmother who exists through stories, values, and something that feels immediate rather than distant, almost alive in daily presence itself. And that creates something quietly powerful, and maybe quietly unsettling for an institution built on control, because once memory becomes personal it stops being manageable and no longer fits within official boundaries or carefully maintained distance anymore in ways no one expected. Because once memory becomes personal it stops being manageable, and suddenly Diana is no longer just the past, she becomes part of the next generation, not as an icon but as influence that spreads quietly across every conversation and interaction over time. From the public perspective it looks like a touching tribute, but beneath it something far bigger is unfolding, a shift in ownership, a quiet transfer of legacy from institution to bloodline, from official narrative to lived memory that cannot be reversed or controlled anymore. It moves silently through family conversations and private storytelling everywhere now. And it didn't happen through a declaration, it happened through a conversation, through a father choosing to tell his children truth as he understands it, not as it's presented publicly elsewhere. Through a daughter beginning to carry a name that suddenly feels heavier, deeper, and more real than ever before in time. And once that process begins it doesn't stop, because children don't just inherit stories, they reshape them, question them, and carry them forward in ways no institution can fully predict exactly anymore. Which means Diana's story isn't finished, it's changing quietly, steadily, almost invisibly, becoming something that lives inside family memory rather than public record or official interpretation anymore, and continues evolving with each generation forward. Because it wasn't about marking what was lost, it was about deciding what survives, not in statues, anniversaries, or carefully worded tributes, but in something far harder to control fully. In memory passed from one generation to the next, in questions that don't have easy answers, and a little girl carrying a powerful name forward. And if you sit with it, this wasn't a birthday, it was a turning point, and the real question isn't what William did but what happens next.